Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Kira Foley-Tasman, and I am the Executive Vice President, Chief Operating Officer of Founding Forward. Welcome to tonight's Public Affairs program. You'll hear more at the end about some of our upcoming programs, and you'll see a QR code to complete a survey. But one of the upcoming programs that I wanted to highlight tonight is we are thrilled next week to be welcoming our 11 new scholars, our high school students that are going into college next year, this fall, that we will be awarding almost $500,000. So that is a really exciting program. For tonight's program, we will run just about an hour. The last bit of that hour, about 15 or so minutes, will be questions. All of you have note cards on your seats to write in your questions. Please keep them short. Remember, we'll be filtering through a lot of questions. Our staff will be walking around the room to collect questions. If you have a question and you don't see one of us walking around, please just hold up that card and we will make sure to collect that from you. Please take a moment to silence your cell phones so we don't have any ringing in the midst of the program. And I wanted to thank everyone. All of these programs are made possible through generosity of League members and others who support our work. And it's always remarkable to me that we have about 35% of League members who make a gift to support our work. So if you are in that 35%, I thank you. If you are not, and you're in that 65%, I invite you to join those other members and make a gift to support our work. You can feel free to see myself, see one of our other staff in the back to correct that, but we're always happy to have more support for this work. And then finally, I'm happy to introduce one of our volunteer leaders, our chair of the Education Committee, Mr. Steve Targett, to introduce tonight's program.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to first recognize John Miko's socks. Well done, John. It's my pleasure to give a couple introductions this evening. James Schultz is the Executive Vice President for Global, Legal, and Public Policy at Scientific Games. He served as General Counsel for the Governor of Pennsylvania, and in 2017, he was the Senior Associate Counsel and Special Assistant to the President of the White House Counsel's Office. In 2023, Jim was elected Chairman of the Delaware River Port Authority, the Regional Transportation Agency. He was partner at both law firms of Cozen O'Connor and Holland & Knight. Mr. Schultz, welcome. And Michael McGinley is a partner at Dechert and a global chair of their Securities and Complex Litigation Practice Group. In the past 4 months, he's argued 3 cases before the United States Supreme Court. He's previously served as Associate Counsel and Special Assistant to the President of the United States, and earlier served as a law clerk to the Supreme Court Justice Alito, and Justice Neil Gorsuch when he was on the U.S. Court of Appeals. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. McGinley. And everybody knows our leader with the great socks, Mr. John Miko. Gentlemen, welcome, and thank you for being here this evening.
Thank you, Steve. So tonight we're going to talk about executive orders. We're going to do a little bit of history, a little bit of Constitution 101, and we'll talk about Trump and executive orders, and we'll go right up to the president, I hope. But first of all, welcome members, Jim and Mike, 2 of our great members. Thanks for being here.
Our pleasure.
And if you need socks, Jim, I can help you with that. Okay.
Once spring hits, no socks for me.
I'm pretty boring compared to you guys.
So what we thought we would do is give a little bit of a tutorial. What is an executive order? What is how does Congress pass a law? Kind of that Constitution 101. So to help us with that, we have a short video that kind of sets out, I hope, both the content and tone of the evening. So Ed, if you would run the video. Thank you.
We now return to a brand new episode of Schoolhouse Rock.
Boy, you really have to climb a lot of steps to get to this Capitol building in Washington, D.C. Say, what's that piece of paper doing here?
Oh, you mean me? I tell you who I am. I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a bill. And I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill. But I know I'll be a law someday. At least I hope and pray that I will. But today I am still just a bill.
Cool. What kind of bill are you?
Why, I'm an immigration bill. And one day the Republicans might create me so I could become a law.
And how does a bill become a law?
Funny you should ask. Well, first I go to the House and they vote on me. But then I need from the Senate a majority. And if I pass the legislative test, then I wind up on the president's desk. And I say, my sweet Woodrow Wilson. My legs, they were made of paper.
President Obama, what's the big idea? That bill was trying to become a law.
I realize that. But you know, son, there's actually an even easier way to get things done around here. It's called an executive order.
I'm an executive order, and I pretty much just happened. And that's it.
Wait a second, don't you have to go through Congress at some point?
Oh, that's adorable. You still think that's how government works?
Don't listen to him, son. Look at the midterm elections. People clearly don't want this. Oh, you black ass! Oh, God! Oh, why? Why did I come back? I think I landed on my keys.
Mr. President, is this constitutional?
Of course. Presidents issue executive orders all the time.
That's right. I could do lots of things. I'll create a national park or a new holiday.
Or grant legal status to 5 million undocumented immigrants.
Wait, what?
Yep, that's what you're gonna do.
Oh my God, well, I didn't have time to read myself. Whoa! Okay, go big or go home, huh?
This isn't over. We're gonna take you to court. We're gonna shut down all the Congress. Oh, damn it. So many steps. So many steps.
Well, son, what do you think about the government now?
I think I want to go into the private sector.
Me too, son. Me too. One more thing. Live from New York
So there you go. There's your Constitution 101. But so that's Obama, right? And now we're going to talk about another person you probably didn't think we were going to start with. And it's this guy right here, Abraham Lincoln. So behind us is probably the most significant, consequential, most important executive order in the history of our nation, the Emancipation Proclamation. That's an executive order. Mike, tell me about the Emancipation Proclamation as an executive order. Is this a constitutional executive order?
So the Emancipation Proclamation, I do agree, was probably the most consequential executive action. I mean, most historians think that there's a pretty clear through line from the Emancipation Proclamation right to the 13th Amendment. And so you're talking about something that the president signed that literally led to the end of slavery, ultimately, and a constitutional amendment. It was never reviewed by the courts, so far be it from me to say sitting here today whether it was constitutional or not. There was some debate, I think, both at the time within the president's cabinet, and then legal scholars and historians have debated whether or not it was constitutional. I think it's one thing that not many people know is that it's not quite as sweeping as it sometimes is portrayed, and I think that's because Lincoln, while asserting a very aggressive view of the commander-in-chief power, did limit the order on its face within the power that he was asserting. And so he said that he was freeing slaves within the states that remained within rebellion at the time, on the premise that as the commander-in-chief, he had the power to do that, given that we were the Union was in a armed conflict with the Confederacy. He did not do that even for states that at one point were part of the Confederacy, or parts of states that were one point part of the Confederacy. Instead, that happened through legislation, and he didn't do it in the Union. And so I think it's an example of the sweeping power that an executive action can have, but the formal limitations of what it can be as a legal document.
So we're going to talk about Commander-in-Chief and a lot of those other things through the course of this. But let's fast forward. You were both in the first Trump term, first Trump White House. And Jim, take us to that very beginning and some of the executive orders. Take us to those moments right after the inauguration or even right before the inauguration.
So in January 19th, 2017, Don McGahn, who was appointed White House counsel at the time, convened a group that included Mike and I and the rest of the team from the White House counsel's office, about 20 lawyers in a conference room at Jones Day because the president hadn't been sworn in yet, so we had our first unofficial meeting as a team in that office. And he gave us a mandate at that point. He said, look, we're going to keep everybody straight in this place. We're going to execute on regulatory reform, and we're going to appoint conservative judges and justices, and we had an open seat on the Supreme Court at the time. And we entered the next day into the White House, and we were like the dog that caught the bumper at that point in time, right? Nobody expected us to win. A lot of folks in that room didn't expect we were going to win, and you didn't see the preparedness that you kind of saw in this term fast forward, and I'll get to that in a minute. But what we did see was a series of executive orders that hit the desk kind of within the first 10 days of the presidency, a couple of which came out were a little clunky. I mean, you had the travel ban that came out and had to be reworked by the White House counsel's office. Our then boss, Don McGahn, made some recommendations so that that could put some limitations on it that made sense and made it palatable and constitutional. And you also saw that, at that point in time, you fast forward and you get to, he loses the election in 2020. And I think, and a lot of people will boo me in this room, I think that was a blessing for a variety of reasons. We had to endure the 4 years of Joe Biden, but at the end of those 4 years, during that time frame, the America First Policy Committee, which was comprised of a number of folks that we worked with in the White House counsel's office and various iterations of the White House counsel's office after we left, went to work. And they really created the framework for what we saw, which was an aggressive number of executive orders that came out, a record number of executive orders that were put forth and signed by the president, but in a more organized fashion. And in a way that had been able to be reviewed by counsel prior to them hitting the street, if you will. And I think that preparedness is what we're seeing the results of that now. And you're seeing some of the challenges that are mounting, but they're more prepared for the challenges in this term than we were in the first term.
So we'll get back to a lot of that in a minute. Mike, tell us about executive orders. Go into the weeds a little bit on how that happens, the process, if you will, and are they all the same? Are they all created equal?
Yeah, no, they're not created equal. And actually, we often talk about executive orders, but there's also presidential memoranda and presidential proclamations, which are all loosely deemed executive actions. And they all kind of do the same thing. There's just a different format for doing it. A memorandum usually is directing government officials to do something the way that a memo in a business might. And then proclamations, which of course is what the Emancipation Proclamation was, is a more externally facing declaration of here's a policy that we support. But generally speaking, they can either go from the top down. I mean, for us, literally there would be a tweet sometimes that would announce what the policy was, and then everybody in the White House would scramble to put together some form of executive action to legally implement that. Or they can come from the bottom up, where you might have either the president's policy advisors in the White House or someone in one of the agencies, a cabinet secretary or a policy person out there will say, here's an idea that we want to pursue. It's an iterative process between the policy folks and the lawyers, particularly the White House counsel's office and the Department of Justice. And the Justice Department does ultimately have to bless every executive order for what they call form and legality. And And then the OMB will often run an interagency process to get the views of all the different relevant agencies. And then within the White House, there's a position called the staff secretary, which is a little known position, but a very important position, essentially the gatekeeper of all paper that goes to the president. So in this presidential term, you'll see when the president signs executive orders, there will be a young lawyer who I went to law school with, Will Sharf, who will hold up the executive order and he'll give a little spiel for the camera and to the president, Mr. President, this executive order does such and such. That person within the White House makes sure that all of the relevant White House components have weighed in. So the Domestic Policy Council, National Economic Council. So there's typically a lot that goes into it that is policy and law.
Of note, the importance of that position, Justice Brett Kavanaugh had that position during the Bush administration. So that is a very key position, and you had some very successful folks that have come out of that position of staff secretary. People think staff secretary, what the heck is that? That's next to the White House counsel, probably the most prominent lawyer in the office.
Right.
So on the little video we had, Obama says, "Oh, that's cute. You think that's the way government works." But isn't that supposed to be the way government works? Meaning Congress passes a law, brings a bill along, creates a law, and Obama, as I recall, I've got a pen, I know how to use it, right? Specifically said that Congress isn't getting the job done, so I'm going to make the law. I mean, that was his message. Tell me, is that a constitutional way of thinking about this? I'll look to you, Jim, to comment on dysfunction in Congress, and did they help create this executive order kind of extravaganza we're seeing?
Look, you don't have to look any farther than what's going on in the House and the Senate now to see that in the last decade, or maybe 2 decades, that Congress has really been kind of at loggerheads and unable to get a lot done, right? The Senate and the House are unable to get a lot done. So what happens then? That vacuum needs to be filled politically. A president has an agenda, and the way to advance that agenda is through executive orders when the Congress won't otherwise act. And, it's also a way, like Mike stated, for the president to kind of set forth his policy agenda as well. We've seen, for instance, a repeat on a couple of them. One we were just talking about earlier was during the first term, it was for every regulation that was advanced, 3 had to go. And in this administration, the second iteration of that, for every regulation that is advanced, 10 have to go now. So that's really, that's the regulatory reform agenda that they're continuing, that we started and Mike spearheaded, and then the rest of us worked along with Mike that had liaison responsibilities to the agencies to make sure that they were following that.
Yeah, and I think it's not just the dysfunction of Congress, but the rise of the administrative state. I think it's no coincidence that the increase in executive orders have come along with the rise in the administrative state, because as Congress delegates more of its lawmaking powers into the executive branch, that empowers the president through executive actions to direct policy through executive orders.
I'm going to push back a little bit on getting stuff done, because my reading of the founders and how they put together this constitutional order was they didn't want to get stuff done. Right. That it was intentionally set up to slow things down, to make it an iterative process, not just in one function, but among the 3 branches of government, so that if someone goes off the rails, there are balances to that. But comment on that, Jim.
But to Mike's point, the thousands upon thousands of pages of regulations, I don't believe is something that was contemplated in that time either. And when you talk about regulatory reform, these regulations not only have come with civil penalties, a lot of times they come with criminal penalties. And we were talking about something that's been passed by regulation, it's a regulation that's gone through the regulatory process, but not passed by Congress, yet has criminal implications. I'm not sure that was contemplated either, which is where executive power steps in, and Mike can talk about the Constitution on that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, John. I think, obviously one of the founding principles was that the fewer laws that go out, the more liberty that we enjoy as individuals and citizens. And then there was also obviously the view as between the federal and state governments, it left more breathing room for state governments, local governments to regulate. But it's just the reality that we live in now. And I think Trump has very aggressively tried to do what's possible to rein things back in, but it's, I wouldn't say we're at a point where it's hopeless, but I think it's just so large that you try to rein it in, but at the same time, as president, you do have the executive power to direct agencies to do things. And so I think what you see with him is simultaneously trying to get control of this large bureaucracy, reduce the amount of burdens on Americans, but then take advantage of his power to direct that bureaucracy.
So for instance, USAID, I think, is a very good example. That was created by Congress as a department within the executive branch of the government, and it was there as a strategic asset for America to combat our enemies, so that our enemies aren't going into nations that are otherwise struggling and co-opting them, if you will, whether it's communism or radical Islamic terrorism or whatever it might be that we want to combat. We used USAID as a strategic asset to combat that, to give aid to those countries so that we could go in and build goodwill and then promote democracy. That small agency turned into an agency that has 10,000 individuals in it now, right? And what Trump saw and what we all saw was the waste, fraud, and abuse coming through that agency. And one example is the billions of dollars at the last minute that went to a nonprofit organization spearheaded by Stacey Abrams, who was essentially a political operative at the end of the day. And there are tons of those examples. And her organization at that point in time had under $1,000 in revenue until she received billions of dollars in grants that came through USAID. For what strategic purpose to advance our interests overseas, I'm not sure.
So you're talking about let's talk about the means, not the end, though, right? So that's the end. The means is an executive order that does away with that. Does the president have the authority to do away with, in some cases, an entire department that has been legislated and funded through law passed by Congress?
So it's an interesting question, and I think if you look at, for example, the Education Department executive order, which was one that really went right at an agency, even there, what the order actually does, it doesn't say the Education Department is hereby dissolved and it will no longer function. What it says is, it says our policy will be to restore, paraphrase, essentially restore educational policymaking to the states, to families, et cetera, and we think the Education Department has sort of run its course. And so I direct the Secretary of the Department of Education to do all within her lawful authority to bring about the dissolution of the department. And so I think it's an implicit recognition that the president most likely does not have the power to just dissolve an agency. It obviously depends on exactly how it's created. But I think in this instance, Congress created it and has funded it, so the president probably doesn't have the authority to do it. But he can say, I want my people in the executive branch to do what they can to pursue this policy. Then that kickstarts a political discussion, which gets that idea out into the political bloodstream. Then you have legislative discussions, and it's a way to advance the idea. Even if you can't technically do it through an executive order, there's ways that you can catalyze other policy outcomes.
And we've seen it with the Department of Education just in the last week or so. We've seen a number of executive orders that came out to support historically black colleges and universities, to support K through 12 in a way, and preparing our children for not just college, but maybe trade school, and recognizing that four-year colleges aren't for everyone, and preparing folks for the industrial jobs and the service jobs that are going to come out of energy and other things that they're trying to promote in this administration. And it's not a slash and burn of the Department of Education, but what it might be is the goal is to give back, should the Department of Education be setting forth policies for the entire country on how to educate our children, or should we be going back to the localities and giving them the power and the funds from the federal government, not cutting the funds from education, but giving the funds in block grant form so that states and local elected officials and school boards can make those determinations in a state-by-state, county-by-county, and municipality-by-municipality basis.
Yeah, and the other thing I'd say too is, in addition to, obviously it has its legal effect, which is it binds the executive branch when an executive order goes out. It's literally like a military order, right? But it's the head of the executive branch directing something to happen, creates a messaging. But I think it also gives a lot of political cover to the agency heads or the political staff that are oftentimes trying to wrangle career bureaucrats who may not agree, particularly if you're going to dismantle their agency, they may not agree with what you're trying to do, but having it in a formal legal document that's been issued, published in the Federal Register, and is a declaration of the president's orders to do something, I think does add some oomph so that the agency heads or the political staff that operate beneath them can go in and say, you've been ordered to do X, Y, and Z by the president. You can't countermand that.
So let's talk about some other specific executive orders. Immigration. We have a series of immigration executive orders, but the big one, which is and there's a question of birthright citizenship. The 14th Amendment, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, in large part due to this guy right here, our patron saint, Abraham Lincoln, sets out the idea of birthright citizenship. And I'm going to take a little bit of a detour here and start with this, actually. So on this stage, Robbie George, some of you know Robbie George, constitutional scholar, and Justice Scalia discussed the idea of everyone needing to worry about the Constitution. And by everyone, they meant every citizen, especially elected officials, especially the President of the United States and the Congress. And I remember Scalia and Robbie George saying they couldn't stand when someone would say something like, we'll let the courts figure it out, right? So this is kind of a two-part or maybe even a three-part question. How is that working right now? And how does that work with the immigration orders themselves in terms of constitutionality? Where does that discussion happen? And shouldn't it happen in the very beginning?
So from a policy perspective, right? So let's start with the birthright citizenship. I think that's a good example, but not the best example in terms of the executive orders that have been issued on immigration. That's one that the president has been talking about since his days, long before he was thinking about running for president. He was talking about birthright citizenship and the fact that that there should be no birthright citizenship. And I imagine there was a conversation in the White House counsel's office. This is something the president's going to do. He's going to advance it anyway. We have to defend it, and we got to prepare to defend it. But you'll put your best defense on, but your likelihood of winning at the Supreme Court, probably not great. But you're not going to stand in front of that train, if you will, at the end of the day, because the president's the president. He's going to want this is the top-down approach to executive orders that Mike talked about earlier, rather than the bottom-up. And now they're going to be to court. Mike could talk about the court case coming up on May 15th.
Yeah, so it is in court. The Supreme Court is going to hear argument on the 15th of May, which they set for a special session. Otherwise, they'd be done for the year in terms of hearing arguments. The way it's presented to the court for this particular hearing is largely on what's the scope of the remedy. And many in this room have probably heard about the concept of nationwide injunctions, the idea that one district court judge will enjoin a piece of legislation or an executive action throughout the whole country. And there's been debate on this for probably about 10 or 15 years. It started, I guess a few happened during the W administration, a few more during Obama. It's been very common in both Trump administrations and the Biden administration where judges will do this. But, so that's all to say, I agree with Justice Scalia and Robbie George. People should not just be relying on the courts to always be the arbiter of what's right, what's constitutional or lawful. The president, every member of Congress, all of these government officials take an oath of office to uphold and defend the Constitution. And then the whole concept of our separation of powers is they will check each other, and not just because they want to guard their own power jealously, but they'll say, Congress has the ability, if they think the president did something unlawful, to exercise the power of the purse or to pass legislation that might otherwise restrain the president. The Supreme Court and the lower courts obviously have judicial review, and the president has, amongst other things, veto power if he thinks a piece of legislation is unconstitutional. So I do agree with that sentiment, but I would also say to anybody who's afraid, who says, oh, well, Trump's doing all these executive orders, how do we know that they're all lawful? There's no shortage of money funding lawsuits that get filed almost immediately after every executive order is passed.
And to that point, right, you've seen state AGs and the ACLU or some of the more conservative organizations during the Biden administration, when you have these executive orders that hit, state AGs were never really in the business of suing the federal government until kind of last 10 years you've seen it. So what they'll do is they'll foreign shop and pick in a blue state appointed judge who was appointed by a Democratic president who probably has left-leaning, is tended to be left-leaning. Conversely, the same thing when a Democratic president is in office, you'll see, pick a red state judge that's more right-leaning. And you're seeing more and more of these challenges, which is kind of that check and balance that you're seeing play out on all these executive orders.
So let's talk more about separation of powers. There's a cute phrase, I'll use the term was used earlier. The president may not legislate by executive order. As far as I know, that is still the law of the land, if you will. That's from a case that went to the Supreme Court from the Truman administration during the Korean War. Is that just a cute idea, or what's the difference between legislation by Congress and an executive order that legislates? Where is that line?
I mean, so it is true. It's definitely true as a constitutional matter. What has blurred that line, I really do think, is the administrative state and just the rise of lawmaking by the executive branch, which is something that predates, well, it doesn't predate executive orders, but it sort of is independent from executive orders. But the reason why it's become much more possible is because there's so much that the executive branch does that looks like legislation, right? And there's another challenge pending at the Supreme Court right now about whether or not to breathe some new life into what they call the non-delegation doctrine, which essentially says Congress cannot delegate its lawmaking power to the executive branch. Now, it's always been recognized the executive branch has to fill in some interstitial elements. You pass a law, but then the executive branch enforces it, and in the course of enforcing has to set some limits that may not be clear from the law. But that's the line, and as that line went further and further towards Congress saying, create regulations in the public interest or create regulations to protect the environment, it gave the executive branch more power, which then had the net effect of executive orders that are otherwise legitimate can have a lot more sweeping force to them.
So again, separation of powers. I think it was last week Justice Roberts used the word rule of law and endangered in the same sentence, and I believe then used endangered with regard to judicial independence. How do you respond if you're Justice Roberts to what if you're Trump to what he sees as apparently, and he never mentions Trump, but I think it's pretty clear what he's talking about attacks on the court which seem to endanger judicial independence as well as rule of law?
Look, I have a different view on that. I think that, like any public official, when you step into that arena, you're going to be criticized and for the decisions you make. Judges are no exception to that. I think that public criticism, criticizing what their decisions may be, if a red state judge is inserting politics into their decision making. Likewise, on the left, if they're doing the same thing, they should be called to the mat on it. Now, personal attacks, things like that. No, I'm not sanctioning anything like that. But from a policy perspective, from a branch of government, butting heads over particular issues, I see no issue with those types of, healthy discussions by way of the news media, by way of healthy discussions between the executive branch and their public domain, the Congress and their domain, and the judicial branch. It's always been that push and pull between Congress, the executive branch, and Congress. They've always butted heads, and it's not necessarily partisan. If the executive branch encroaches too far on the powers of the legislative branch, they'll call them to the mat on it. It's just now that you're seeing more of that happen as it relates to the judiciary, because you're seeing these orders that are coming out of districts in Oregon that's going to impact the rest of the country.
So before we get to questions, I have to ask Mike a couple of questions about his winter and early spring, which were interesting. Three cases in front of the Supreme Court. You never did that before, right?
No. Thank you. So I blame it on this, John. We knew we were going to do this event, and I knew I had to be prepared.
So Jim, I was talking to Jim, and Jim said we should do this program. I said, sounds good. I gave a date, I think, to the two of you guys, and Mike very modestly said, well, I'm going to be arguing a case in D.C. on that day, and I can't do it. And I said, oh, what's the case? And he told me the case, which was Oklahoma versus the state of Oklahoma versus charter school, which was one of the biggest cases in this whole session, I think without question. But Mike didn't bother to say that. He just said, I'm going to be busy. So thanks for making the time to be with us.
Yeah, and thank you for delaying it.
But
And to be clear, when we were having that discussion, when we were talking about the program and I suggested we bring Mike in, I said to John, I play a constitutional lawyer on TV. We need a real constitutional lawyer to sit in a room here, right? So
my favorite calls from Jim is sometimes I'll get a call just out of the blue and he'll say, I'm going on CNN in 2 hours. What do you think of this?
all the time.
It feels
my
like-
first phone call in the constitutional questions.
but just give us a little taste of what that's like arguing in front of the Supreme Court.
So, the first thing I'd say was an honor. Obviously, I've been a law nerd since I was a little kid, and then going to law school, I had great reverence for the court. I had the great fortune to clerk for 2 justices. One of them, when he was on the 10th Circuit, Justice Gorsuch, I clerked for when he was about my age, serving as a judge on the 10th Circuit, and then I clerked for Justice Alito at the court. So then. My daughter was born the year I was clerking for Justice Alito, so the first place that she ever went outside of our home or the hospital was the Supreme Court. So it's been a big part of our lives.
Talk about a nerd.
Yeah. She is very bright. And it was something that I always aspired to do. I practiced in D.C. As a young lawyer, handled a number of cases at the Supreme Court as number 2. To Paul Clement, who's one of the best Supreme Court advocates ever, but certainly of his generation. So something I always aspired to do. And the first one came, and I'm particularly proud of this because it came from the court itself. The court asked me to argue as an amicus to support a judgment that the federal government was no longer supporting. And so my client was essentially the court or the American people at some level. And then the second case was for a paid client, a case that I'd been litigating for 5 years. And then the third case was a pro bono case, as you mentioned, on the whether there could be religious charter schools in Oklahoma. And I've been litigating that with the Notre Dame Religious Liberty Clinic for the last 3 years. And that's special to me, both because I believe strongly in religious liberty, but I went to Notre Dame as an undergraduate. And so to be doing something with Notre Dame is quite special.
Well, thank you for your service and for your service too, Jim. And most of you, I assume you all watch CNN. So you know Jim from his time as legal analyst on CNN, and he's been a panelist for us on many of these programs as well. So let's get to some questions. This is a good one. So executive orders. How long do they last?
Until they're revoked
Yeah, by
either a next administration or the sitting president.
And what do we see? How often are they revoked?
So the interesting thing is the very first executive order of this Trump presidency was one where he revoked a list of 4 pages of executive orders by President Biden. And he's done a few more since then. I think the title will be something like the rescission of dangerous and awful executive orders or something. and then just lists a whole list of them. And so but it is very common, and there's actually a bunch of executive orders, particularly in the regulatory space, that they just get turned on and off based on whether it's a Republican or a Democrat who comes into office. And so it gets to the point almost like the old way legislation was done, where you would basically say Executive Order 14777 is now back in effect, and Executive Order 1744 that got rid of it is out of effect, and you have to trace back through the executive orders. But the other interesting thing is the tariffs have been done through executive action as well. So even some of those lasted a very short period of time, where the president issued an executive order tariffing Canada or Mexico, and then they cut a deal and he rolls the executive order back.
Which I think is a great negotiating tool, right? When you put the full weight of the presidency behind it by way of executive order, by tariff, by levying those tariffs, you have an ability then to get other countries to the negotiating table, and we've seen some of the fruits of that already.
So there's one, next question's on tariffs. It's about the constitutionality of tariffs. Article 2, Section 8 gives power for tariffs to Congress explicitly. So how does an executive order wind up doing tariffs?
Yep. So again, Congress delegated some of that authority back to the president under a law called IEPA, which is essentially about emergency situations. And so both in the first administration and now again, the president has invoked that law to issue the tariffs. It's a hotly contested.
What's the emergency situation?
Well, so in the case of Canada and Mexico, he cited the flow of drugs and obviously illegal immigration. Same with China. As you get further away from that, the legal authority becomes much more debatable. And there's actually a specialized court in New York called the Court of International Trade that all of these issues funnel into that court. So they're going to have a lot of litigation in that court over the next few years on tariffs, I think. And we did in the first administration.
Does the Constitution provide rights for illegal aliens to due process?
So if you read the text of the Constitution, it seems it does for folks that are here in this country, but that is something that's going to be argued, and Mike can speak more to that. But if you look at the plain text of the Constitution, it says it does.
So give me there's a question about a little bit of history. So executive orders, we didn't really talk about this other than Lincoln, but they've been around since Washington. Give us a little bit of the trajectory of the numbers of them over time. Do either of you have that kind of in your back pocket info?
So I couldn't cite you chapter and verse, but it's clear that they've become more ubiquitous over time. But again, I think that's consistent with the general upshot of lawmaking in our country. I think a lot of the early ones were essentially exercises of a power that's found in what they call the Opinions Clause in the Constitution, which essentially says the president has the right to ask any of his cabinet secretaries to render an opinion to him. Or her, as the case might be, and a lot of even modern executive orders take this form, where it'll be some kind of policy initiative, and the executive order will say, it is the policy of the United States to do such and such. I now direct the secretary of X agency, or maybe 4 or 5 secretaries working together, to, in 120 days, present to me a study or a plan of action on what to do. And so I think the early ones tended to take more of that kind of form, but it is still a common form that you see today.
But I think you've seen more of it since it's really started during the Obama administration, a little bit in the wake of 9/11, post 9/11 during the Bush administration, but really from the Obama administration and then straight into the first Trump administration, using executive power in a more aggressive way.
I have to say, I did Google this, and the first executive order was George Washington ordering his cabinet members to give a report on what the heck is going on in their departments. That is the first executive order. So this is not exactly on point, but it's still a good question. Okay. It's about Chevron. First of all, who's going to explain Chevron? And then what is the Chevron case? And the Trump administration, how's that going to affect the goals of the Trump administration?
So it actually is on point, too, because there is an executive order on the Chevron doctrine issues. So the Chevron doctrine is a now defunct doctrine that the Supreme Court announced in a case that involved Chevron, where they basically said, if a piece of legislation is ambiguous, and we think that Congress intended for an executive agency to exercise some authority in this area, the courts would defer to reasonable interpretations of the legislation, which essentially granted a lot of power for the executive branch to, one might say depart from or otherwise expand upon legislative delegations of power. And as the doctrine evolved, it really put a lot of power in the executive branch, but also took a lot of power away from the courts, because it meant that the courts as long as they thought a law was ambiguous, and if you squint hard enough, A, Congress writes a lot of ambiguous laws, but B, if you squint hard enough, you can often find ambiguity if you're a lawyer. And then they said as long as it's reasonable. So in a case a year or two ago called Loper-Bright, the Supreme Court said no Chevron, there's no more Chevron doctrine. Judges will decide what is the correct interpretation of the law. And so that, along with a number of other landmark Supreme Court decisions, including a number of environmental cases, but religious liberty cases, and other cases reigning in the administrative state, Trump issued an executive order that said, I want every agency to look through all of their existing regulations and figure out if there are regulations that are inconsistent with Loper-Bright, or a case called West Virginia that announced what's called the Major Questions Doctrine, which similarly says we won't assume that Congress gave some enormous power to an agency unless it's clear from the statute. And so it's a deregulatory executive order basically saying take all of these Supreme Court opinions and essentially weaponize them and utilize them to make sure we don't have all these zombie regulations that would no longer stand up in court, but might not be ripe to challenge anymore because the statute of limitations to challenge them had run.
And again, these regulations that carry civil and sometimes criminal penalties, think about the consequence if they have to defer to if courts have to defer to the agency on that, and you're on the business end of that civil or criminal penalty, or your company is. That's why it was so very important that Chevron be overturned, and why all the chambers of commerce and business organizations, and quite frankly, energy companies, because it was used as a sword most frequently through the Environmental Protection Administration.
Have we seen a practical impact already from that case? I was always surprised to learn that there wasn't going to be immediate, impact on the streets, if you will, based on that. But have we seen things change?
I think you have. I think you've seen less enforcement actions, where the government will be less inclined to take a stretch of a case because you don't have the deference, if you will, to the decision of the agency. So yes, the cases have to be tighter when they're brought.
Is that a result of the change in administration or the Chevron doctrine being overturned?
I would say we're going to see the results of it down the road as a result of changing the administration, but certainly from the Chevron doctrine being overturned.
Yeah, I agree.
So how does Congress alter an executive order or stop an executive order?
So the topic obviously has to be within Congress's own legislative power, but if something is within Congress's legislative power and they pass a law through bicameralism and presentment, they're probably going to have to override a veto if they're doing something in an executive order. I'm trying to think of an example off the top of my head. I can't think of one sitting here, but legislation would trump an executive order unless the executive order is within the president's exclusive power.
And in reality, it's less. The reason why I can't think of anything is because it's not likely to happen because it's so hard to get anything through Congress, like we talked about earlier. It's much easier to have state attorneys general or interest groups challenge it in the courts.
So there are some examples that go back to the post-Lincoln era, where Johnson, as president, had a Republican majority against him that was huge, and executive order after executive order was, and in fact, they did impeach him. And he survived by one right. vote, actually, the impeachment itself. So what do you see next with executive orders? What are the big executive orders we haven't heard about? And just give us your crystal ball, you two insiders, as to what we're going to see.
So I think you really have to look at the Trump agenda, right? I think you're going to continue to see executive order after executive order on the immigration issue. As one gets, if one gets knocked down, you're going to see another one coming right behind it, and trying to find creative ways to deal with an issue that's been, the borders have been open for so long. The number of undocumented immigrants in this country, I think they talk about a number of 11 million. It's probably a lot more than that. The folks came in, Scott Jennings just made a point the other night on TV where he said, when you talk about process, people came into this country with virtually no process. Now we have to figure out a way to to deal with that issue now that they're here and respect the rule of law, but also come up with a way that it doesn't take years and years and years to work through a court process just to get one person who shouldn't be here out of the country.
So one of those people is Garcia, who the administration said, yes, that was a mistake, shouldn't have been deported. So due process, you talked about it a little bit. Why not bring him back?
So the court told them that the last order of the court used the word facilitate, which was short of what the district court had ordered them to do. And facilitate is what? Facilitate is try to make it easier for that person to come back to this country. If El Salvador doesn't want that person back in the United States, there's not a darn thing that the Department of Homeland Security can do about it. And it was telling when you had the president of El Salvador sit in the room when asked the question and said, why would you want a terrorist back in your country?
So the political question, not a legal question, why not bring him back? And do we really believe that Trump couldn't get him back if he wanted him back?
I don't know the answer to that, but they said the word facilitate. They didn't order the federal government to go grab him out of El Salvador. So I think in this particular instance, I think when you have members of Congress going to El Salvador and going and meeting with this person, there was a court of record that found that this person, found as a result of the police reports and other things, that this person had ties to a terrorist organization. And it came back and the court ordered at that time during the immigration process and they made a finding that the reason why they had a withholding to keep him in this country, which means he could still go to another country, not El Salvador, was because because there was a rival gang that put his life in danger. I think the key word there is rival gang. So what are we doing here is the question, right? Like, we could talk about process all day long. There was a mistake made, and at the end of the day, the courts have said you need to facilitate that. They don't want to send him back. He's not coming back.
Three questions on drug prices and drug pricing. What's the implementation look like for getting that executive order done? Any ideas?
I think it's a good question. I think that there are many lawyers at HHS and the FDA and other places that are probably trying to figure that out.
Scratching our heads as well, and I mean, that's the full employment plan for big law with big pharma, right? So I think that with guys like Mike and Mike's firm and other firms that represent big pharma are going to have a field day working through that.
All right, so I have these are, I like this question. So with the exception of Trump and his executive orders, and Abraham Lincoln in that one, what are the best executive orders?
Oh.
I'm going to defer to Mike.
Yeah, so I mean, one that I would say has been more long-lasting than the typical one was, it's called 1866.
1866.
1866.
Everyone got that?
Yeah, and what it essentially did was...
How did you know it's 1866 and not 1867?
I don't know. It's in my head. I don't know. I'm weird. And what it basically did was set up the regulatory review, the modern regulatory review process for cost-benefit analysis, and added a sort of rigor, and it centralized control of that process for major regulations at OMB and thus essentially the White House. So it gave the president more authority over reviewing regulations as they were bubbling up through the system. And essentially each administration for the last 40 or so years has kept it, but they've tweaked it, right? So Republicans, generally speaking, emphasize a lot more of the cost-benefit aspect, 1 in, 10 out, or net neutral budgeting. Democrats, when they come in, they like the process, but they emphasize more qualitative things like social justice or other things, and so they sort of fiddle with how the review happens. But it's kind of a structural executive order that said this is how we're going to run the regulatory process going forward.
And what's the worst?
Oh, probably internment.
Internment?
Yeah.
Explain.
The Japanese internment, I think, happened through executive order.
It did,
Yeah. And obviously the court upheld it originally, but in recent years the Supreme Court said it was unconstitutional.
Yeah, so this is the Japanese internment, FDR, who I think has the record. He probably does, because he was there the longest for executive orders. and given that we were, in fact, in a war. But yeah, the Japanese internment, which was upheld by the Supreme Court.
Originally, yeah.
Originally, yeah. Any on your top 10 list, Jim?
No, you know what? I mean, Mike just told a good story on the way in, which is the 1 in, 3 out in the last administration, the 1 in, 10 out in this one. And it was telling on how you implement that, right? So Mike said earlier that you have the administrative state, which is a huge bureaucracy pushing against that. They want a lot of folks, career officials, they've invested in what they've created there. And, you know, when you get the call and you over to the deputy secretary and they receive that phone call saying that, you know, the 1 in, 3 out discussion, which regulations are going off the books, and that your secretary, when he comes over and meets with the president, is going to have to be held accountable to that number. I think that one is going to have the most impact on as far as regulatory reform, you know, minus the Chevron decision, that executive order will have the single most impact on regulatory reform between the first Trump administration and this Trump administration that we've seen in, you know, modern history.
So one last question. Outside of the immigration the May 15th hearing, what is the other big executive order that's going to be looked at by the court in that same kind of way?
I mean, the tariffs are definitely going to wind through the court. Where they land as a policy matter will determine, I think, the result.
Do you think that'll get to the Supreme Court?
It could. The last time it didn't. Trying to think. I mean, immigration is obviously the biggest one. I don't know. Do you have any ideas, Jim?
No. I mean, look, I just said the immigration is the one. I think we're just going to continually see immigration. I think the things that, you know, the executive order on men and women's sports, as they coined it with this administration, you know, that type of an executive order that has a big splash. They got all the big splashes early. So now it's just a grind for the next 4 years. And depending upon what happens in midterms is really going to, I think, determine how aggressive they are with executive orders going forward. I think you know, if midterms go the other way, meaning Democrats take over, I think you could see an uptick in executive orders because that's the only way he's getting anything done.
Yeah. Actually, one other answer, I think, less so the executive order itself that created DOGE, but I think some of the things that DOGE or some of the other aggressive deregulatory actions, so the things that flow out of the executive orders that created DOGE and tasked it with certain mandates, I do think those will go up through the courts.
Ladies and gentlemen, please thank Jim Schultz, Mike McGinley. Gentlemen, thank you. Thank you. We're looking for your input. Please, the QR code, take a picture, give us your thoughts on tonight's program and other ideas you have. May 27th, Public Affairs Examining Trump's Policy, Domestic Affairs. We look forward to seeing you May 27th right here at the Union League. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Have a wonderful evening. And again, thank you, Jim and Mike.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Great job.